The Case of the Yellow Sign. One of the strangest affairs ever to vex the prodigious intellect of my friend Sherlock Holmes, the great consulting detective, occurred early in the year 1890. Even today he does not speak of it, preferring to dismiss the whole business with a peremptory gesture and a firm insistence that I do not set down any record of those bizarre events. And yet I feel honour bound to leave some account of what happened, if only for my own peace of mind. For I feel we encountered a prodigious threat that remains undefeated to this day, one that may more than vex the entire world in the near future. Holmes, I am sure, would not agree. And so I will submit this bizarre tale to paper, knowing that it will be secreted in a bank vault and not opened until after both Holmes and I have shuffled off our mortal coils. Make of this story what you will, dear reader. It was a bleak February evening when we first became aware of the yellow sign. I was reading through back issues of the Strand magazine while a sleeting rain battered the windows of 221B Baker Street. Holmes was performing some arcane experiment in chemistry on an improvised workbench, staring fixedly at test tubes and flasks, indifferent to his surroundings. The familiar sound of the Bunsen burner vied with the foul weather's din and the crackle of logs on the fire. I knew better than to try and engage my friend in conversation. He was clearly diverting his mind from the major challenge he encountered again and again. Without a problem to grapple with, he was all too prone to seek solace in the hypodermic. Holmes knew how much I disapproved of his cocaine habit, and this perhaps limited his abuse of the drug, up to a point. Yet I was also well aware, from bitter experience, that if he did not find something truly challenging to occupy his extraordinary brain very soon, he would reach for the accursed needle, no matter how much I protested. It was therefore with relief that I heard the familiar sound of Mrs. Hudson's footsteps on the stairs, followed by her knock at the door. Her arrival almost always heralded a new client. I rose to let her in, while Holmes continued to be absorbed in his experiment. Our good landlady smiled apologetically as I opened the door. "I'm sorry to trouble you, gents, but I found this on the doormat as I was letting the cat in out of the rain. It seems as though somebody pushed it through the letterbox just now." I took the small white envelope and turned it over curiously. It was addressed to Sherlock Holmes, Esquire, in a flowing script. The ink was a very dark brownish red and bore a disturbing resemblance to dried blood. I thanked Mrs. Hudson and asked her to bring up some tea, then handed the letter to Holmes, who'd been looking on silently. "Thank you," he said, sniffing the envelope, then holding it up to the light. "No perfume, rather high-grade paper, certainly too dense to see through, not cheap, evidently sent by a person of some means, or an accomplished thief of high-quality stationery. Few British firms manufacture stuff of this quality, though there are dozens on the continent who produce it, of course, so not much of a clue in itself. Very well, hand me the paper-knife, Watson." I stood by while he opened the envelope to reveal nothing more exciting than a standard visiting card, blue-grey in colour. In fact, it proved to be even less informative than most, because it bore no name or address, merely a message written in the same hand as Holmes' name on the outside of the envelope. "Do not take the case if you value your sanity," Holmes read, then snorted in derision. As threats go, what it lacks in potency it certainly makes up for in originality, albeit of a somewhat sparing kind. No promise to blow out my brains or slit my throat, merely the suggestion that I might lose my wits. Ah, but what have we here? Holmes turned the card over to reveal what I at first thought to be merely a smear of yellow dye. But as I looked more closely, I saw it was an odd symbol, one strange to me. I asked Holmes if he'd ever seen it before, and he replied in the negative. "And yet," he added meditatively, "it seems oddly familiar, does it not? Curious, most curious. A genuine enigma. I admit my curiosity is piqued, if only a little." He took the card over to his workbench and began to assemble some new apparatus. I knew without needing to ask that he was planning to subject the cards to some test to determine the nature of the ink. But before he could begin, Mrs. Hudson returned. This time she was not alone. She ushered into the room the familiar form of Inspector Lestrade, Scotland Yard's most senior detective, whose oilskin dripped onto the rug as he stood by the fire to warm himself. After the usual formalities, Holmes asked what the police required of him now. "Well, Mr. Holmes, that's a good question," said Lestrade, looking uncomfortable. It's a mystery that's giving us all the creeps down the yard. Seems a whole bunch of people have gone balmy. An epidemic of pure madness, you might say." "People go mad every day, my dear Inspector," observed Holmes, flinging his gangling form into an easy chair. "We live in chaotic and violent times, and any man with an unusually sensitive intellect is bound to suffer appalling distress if they simply read their morning newspaper. Wars and rumours of wars, corruption and cruelty, the list is almost endless, and we have never been better informed about the depraved nature of our species. Hence the lunatic asylums are bursting at the seams. Why come to me about it?" Lestrade hesitated, then took out a notebook. "Well, Mr. Holmes, it's like this. Every single one of these newfound loonies— begging your pardon, Doctor, I meant to say these here mental cases— every single one of them was either a collector of rare books or a dealer in them, sometimes both. Seems like they were connected, each one known to all the rest. We can't work out why they all went crackers within a few weeks of each other, but it does look pretty darn suspicious, don't you think?" Holmes' attitude changed at once from a certain languid contempt to alert and bright-eyed interest. He fired off a series of questions, which Lestrade answered as best he could. Then Holmes jumped up and strode to his workbench, where he retrieved the mysterious visiting card. "Take a look at this, Inspector," he said, holding the card out to Lestrade. "Do either the symbol or the writing strike you as familiar?" Lestrade turned the card over and paused, mouth agape. "Bloody hell, that's it," he breathed. "That yellow daub was found on the garden gate of one of the gents concerned." Then Lestrade read the message, and his eyes widened. He looked at Holmes, then back at the card, before returning it to my friend, as if he feared he might catch insanity from it. "Then it is a criminal matter, since they've threatened you." Holmes chuckled, a typically humourless sound. "They did indeed, and with the effect they probably intended. I have never let threats prevent me from pursuing an investigation, and this fact is well known, thanks to Watson's somewhat extravagant accounts of my activities in that popular journal, The Strand magazine." I sighed at the backhanded compliment. "Really, Holmes," I protested, "I merely set down the facts, and in this instance it seems likely that you may have already solved the mystery. It seems remarkably similar to the case of the Devil's Foot." "Oh, yes," said Lestrade, brightening considerably. "I've forgotten about that. Not one of mine, of course, but the Cornish police were most impressed. That means you might think it's some sort of obscure chemical, perhaps in the form of a gas?" Holmes nodded in approval, then stalked over to the window to look out at what was now a raging blizzard. "Well remembered, both of you," he said. "It may be that our victims were poisoned in some way as to unhinge their minds. One obvious possibility is that the pages of a rare book were impregnated with a powerful opiate or similar organic chemical. New plants and fungi containing strange poisons are being discovered by explorers every year." Holmes walked to his well-ordered bookshelves and began to run a finger along the spines of various bound journals. "Here we are. Proceedings of the Royal Geographical Society. We may find something of value here, eh, Watson? Yes, the Amazon basin offers the enterprising malefactor a veritable witch's kitchen of such species. Using a hitherto unknown poison would be the ideal way for a rogue dealer to both eliminate competition and perhaps buy up their stock. After all, if they don't recover, someone will have to pay for the cost of these poor devils' confinement. Their relatives will sell their books, and being ignorant of their real value, they will probably sell cheap, having merely glanced at the volumes in question." Lestrade clapped his gloved hands together with glee. "Brilliant, Mr. Holmes," he exclaimed. "Why, I've barely been here 5 minutes, and you've already as good as cracked it. I'll get my chaps to examine the books." Oh. Holmes grinned sardonically as he turned to face the inspector. "Yes, it might be best to ensure your men wear gloves while examining the collector's volumes, especially any book they might have been reading shortly before they suffered this nervous breakdown. And if you could provide me with a list of these hapless bibliophiles?" Seeing Lestrade's confusion, I attempted to enlighten him. "The book dealers, Inspector?" Lestrade produced a handwritten list and left, still loudly expressing his thanks to Holmes for his assistance. After the door slammed, I remarked that Lestrade's gratitude would not, as per usual, extend to actually thanking my friend in front of the assembled gentlemen of the world's press. "I don't care if he takes the credit, Watson," Holmes said airily. "Let Lestrade strut in the light of publicity. Let him crow on the dunghill of fame. He has a career to consider, not to mention a wife and children to provide for. Any satisfaction I feel is over a problem solved, evil defeated, chaos held at bay, and— Well, what is this? He'd returned to his workbench and had begun examining the mysterious visiting card again. Without another word, he handed it to me. I glanced at it, then stared. The yellow symbol had vanished, as had the blood-red script on the card's other side. It was now simply a blank rectangle. "Our shadowy friend of the yellow symbol issues interesting threats," Holmes said quietly. "Perhaps this is a problem worthy of my abilities after all, eh? More tests are needed, Watson. In the meantime, please read out the list." I did so, noting that the victims, if victims they were, seemed to live in very disparate neighbourhoods. The collectors were all apparently well-to-do gentlemen with surplus wealth to spend on rare volumes. The dealers, by contrast, mostly had business premises in the less salubrious parts of our great metropolis. It was ever thus, said Holmes, dripping a pipette of some clear liquid onto the card. No, it seems this intriguing card bears no traces of ordinary vanishing ink. Something altogether more elaborate must have been used. Why, this is wonderful, Watson, quite wonderful. It seems that, despite the demise of my arch-enemy, London is not entirely devoid of criminal genius. The oblique reference to Professor Moriarty evoked mixed feelings on my part. On the one hand, I was pleased that Holmes had his shoulder to the wheel, mentally speaking, and was taking up a real challenge. This would remove, for the time being, any chance that he would inject himself with a 7% solution of cocaine. On the other hand, however, I recalled how my friend had only narrowly cheated death when he confronted that evil genius Moriarty at the Reichenbach Falls. I did not want him to have so close a brush with the Grim Reaper again. Still, I reflected, the world of book collecting was unlikely to be the arena of the worst criminals. "Make yourself useful, Watson," Holmes said briskly. "Gather all the evening papers and see if any of them have anything on this strange outbreak of madness. It would be surprising if some enterprising reporter had not stumbled onto a fact or two. The game's afoot." I duly searched through the papers, but found nothing significant apart from one small item in the Daily Gazette. It referred to a certain Galton Sproat, bookseller in the parish of Seven Dials, who'd apparently been found wandering the streets in a distracted state, almost devoid of clothing and liable to die from exposure. No charges had been brought, and Sproat had instead been committed by a magistrate to the county asylum. "Sproat," Holmes murmured. "Read me the dates of the cases again." I did so, and the detective nodded sagely. "Sproat was the first to go insane," Holmes said. "Then came a second dealer, then 3 book collectors in a row. Interesting, is it not? If madness is infectious, then it seems the epidemic began in the otherwise unremarkable district of Seven Dials." Then he cursed loudly and threw down the blue-grey card. "No, I'm dashed if I can find anything unusual in its chemical composition," he declared. "If I were a superstitious man, I would say the thing had been enchanted. But as I am a man of science, I must conclude that the person who deposited this through our letterbox is a chemist of extraordinary ability." With that, Holmes declared that he needed to think, and picked up his Stradivarius. I knew that he would play far into the night, and so made my excuses and went to bed, stopping up my ears with cotton wool, as was my custom on such occasions. Music hath its charms, no doubt, but not when it is from a violin played in the small hours. That night I was troubled by a most peculiar dream, or rather nightmare. I found myself in an ancient city, not Roman or Greek in character, but more Babylonian or Egyptian in feel. I was clad in strange robes, following a group of similarly clad people to a temple. Everything about the scene was disturbing. The architecture had a warped, asymmetric look to it, and I felt sure that the hooded robes concealed faces that were malign, deformed, or perhaps not even truly faces at all. And I also dreaded the dark portal of the temple that loomed above me, knowing that within lurked not a mere pagan idol, but a living and powerful entity, and I knew that this entity was cold, vicious, and all too capricious in its dealings with mere mortals. A name boomed out of the darkness, a name I'd never heard before, a name that seemed of the utmost significance, one that was perilous to hear, let alone repeat. But when I awoke to see the dull grey of the morning feebly illuminating the curtains of my bedchamber, I could not recall the name at all. I lay in bed for a few minutes, feeling out of sorts, so tired it was as if I'd not really slept at all. But then I heard Mrs. Hudson rebuking Holmes for staying up all night, and filling the place with the fog from that awful pipe." Smiling at this return to normality, I got up, put on my dressing gown, and went out to enjoy a leisurely breakfast. I was bleary-eyed and washed out, so much so, in fact, that Holmes remarked upon it. I said something about a nightmare. "Poor digestion, my friend," Holmes observed, wolfing down scrambled eggs on toast. "Almost always the cause of disturbed sleep. Prescribe yourself something to help you slumber. Physician, heal thyself, eh?" I almost began an argument about the risks of taking drugs for every little problem, but bit my tongue. Instead, I asked what Holmes had planned for us that day. He waved the blank visiting card from yesterday at me and asked if I could recall the mysterious yellow symbol that had adorned it. I frowned, trying to remember the exact shape of the thing. I admitted I couldn't recall it clearly, merely that it looked odd and somehow malign. "Really, Watson, it was like this," he said, and held out a piece of paper, upon which he'd drawn something like an inverted question mark with a crooked bar slashed across its middle. "What do you make of it?" he asked. "Perhaps a letter in an unfamiliar alphabet," I hazarded. "One of the many Asian languages, perhaps?" "Wrong, though a fair guess," Holmes barked. "I spent several hours checking this sign or character against my exhaustive directory of foreign languages. I found no correspondence. No, I feel it is almost certain this is some obscure symbol. Remember the reference to the yellow sign. Now, I found no mention of it in all my files. There is nothing in the Encyclopaedia Britannica. That suggests—" "What?" I was still bleary from sleep and slightly annoyed that my friend had, as so often in the past, dismissed my suggestion so abruptly. "It is known to very few, perhaps members of a cult, and a dangerous one if the fates of the book dealers is any indication." "Possibly," Holmes conceded, "or perhaps it is the merest humbug, something invented a short while ago by a clever fraudster to make us think we are dealing with some ancient symbol with mysterious associations. But enough speculation. Finish your breakfast, Watson, and get dressed. We go to Seven Dials to inspect the scene of Galton Sproat's nervous collapse." The foul winter weather of yester-eve had given way to one of our famous London particulars. The fog unusually dense, yellowish, and greasy. As our hansom cab clopped slowly through the crowded streets, Holmes and I spoke in desultory phrases about how the supposed victims might have been driven insane. Holmes' theory that a drug might have been used to taint the pages of a book seemed possible, even likely. "But why do it?" I demanded. "Who cares about books enough to resort to those measures?" Holmes gave his characteristic sharp laugh. "Bibliophiles tend to be fanatical, Watson," he said. "All collectors are touched by madness, to a degree. But I admit that it is a rather extreme measure, and its purpose is by no means clear. No, I must reserve judgment until— but here we are, Seven Dials. Now we shall see." The fog made it difficult to find the bookshop of Galton Sproat, and it took a sixpence handed to a street urchin to get accurate directions. When we found the shop, it proved disappointing, a run-down, poky little place, now locked and shuttered. Holmes was an expert picklock, but first he insisted on going around the back of the shop. And there it is. We were standing just outside the back door of the shop. I followed his pointing finger and saw, painted quite high on the wall, the yellow sign. It was indeed the same as the one on the visiting card. This one, however, seemed to have been daubed with regular paint rather than some vanishing ink. Holmes then took out his lock-picking kit and let us in through the back entrance. Inside, Sproat's shop was no more impressive than its exterior. We found ourselves in a small back office, an untidy place of dog-eared business ledgers, pens, and ink bottles. A half-burned candle stood in a holder on a small desk, beside a pencil and some papers. Holmes picked up the topmost sheet, then passed it to me. It seemed Sproat had been making notes on a book. Date of pub, ? Printer not given. How many copies, ? Cult of H. Casilda, real person, ? Deformity. A robe, ? Madness. The final word had been underlined so heavily that the paper was partially torn. I shuddered at the thought that insanity might have overcome the book dealer at just that moment. "What do you make of it, Watson?" Holmes asked, apart from the obvious of course that the book was a mystery even to a professional dealer like Sproat. "Casilda," I said, musing on the short list. "Could it be the author? Sounds like a woman's name, almost certainly a foreigner." Holmes chuckled at that. Consider, Watson, the query our Mr. Sproat has put next to the name. Is Casilda a real person? Now, if he were referring to the author of a book, he would use a proper book dealer's term, such as pen name or nom de plume. No, he wonders if this lady, it does seem feminine, does it not, is a real person. I had to agree with this analysis. Now, the use of the word cult is intriguing, Holmes went on. Cult of H. Not very helpful, as there are probably any number of deities, or indeed demons, which begin with that letter, assuming any form of religious cult is intended, of course. In the context, it seems likely. I remarked that the words deformity and madness were also telling. I suggested that the book in question might deal with just those topics. There is a lot of rather morbid literature around these days, Holmes agreed. It seems people don't want wholesome fiction anymore. It's horror and ugliness they seek. Perhaps such a preoccupation is the mark of a decadent society. Holmes moved on to peruse the ledgers of the dead bookseller. He found, not surprisingly, that all of the other victims of the madness epidemic were listed among many other names. Holmes started noting down the names and addresses, and I decided to explore Sproat's shop. Leaving the cramped office, I found myself in an even more claustrophobic space. The second-hand bookstore, like many of its kind, was a maze of high shelves stacked with dusty volumes, seemingly thrown together at random, with a bookish overflow piled up in heaps here and there. I had to squeeze down one aisle to find my way to the desk, and from thence to the front door. It was securely locked, and I spent a moment looking out at the swirling yellow-grey fog. There seemed to be no passers-by, but then a shrouded figure appeared, emerging from the murk to stand, apparently staring in through the glass panel in the door. I strained my eyes to try and make out a face, but it seemed that the stranger was wearing some kind of hooded cloak, evidently a woman then, though a rather tall one. As quickly as it had appeared, the mysterious figure vanished. I turned back to the shop's interior, oddly disturbed by the seemingly trivial incident, and it was then that I received a terrible shock. The hooded figure was now standing at the end of the aisle I'd just come down. It was much closer now, but almost entirely in shadow, so I still could not make out a face inside the hood. What I could see was that, at well over 6 feet, it was far too tall for a normal woman, and its hooded cloak, I noted, was not dark, as is customary, but some paler colour. It was hard to tell, but I felt that it might be yellow. "Who are you?" I demanded, "and what are you doing here?" The hooded form did not seem to react at first. Then it began to move toward me, and I reeled back, colliding with the shop door. It was not so much the air of silent menace that terrified me, but the way that the figure seemed to glide, as if moved by something other than human limbs. Closer and closer it came, until it was almost within touching distance, and still I could not make out any features inside that voluminous hood. But I did hear a voice, something like a whisper, that seemed to come from all directions, and also from an immense distance. It spoke 2 syllables. Hastur. "No!" I yelled, holding up an arm to try and ward off the thing. "Watson, what on earth are you playing at?" Holmes was standing over me, and I realized that I was lying on the dusty floor of the bookshop, surrounded by volumes I'd knocked off the shelves in my flailing panic. I let my friend help me to my feet and babbled something about being attacked. Holmes listened as I dusted off my garments, then checked the front door. It was still locked and bolted. "No one could have entered or left that way," he said, "and certainly no one passed me in the back office. It seems we have another little mystery to go with the vanishing yellow symbol." Holmes commenced to search the premises, but found no hidden doors or hatchways in the floor or ceiling. He then joked about my jumping at shadows, and told me that we must try to head off the fatal volume by contacting all of the book collectors and dealers. "We will send telegrams to them all," he said, with his usual decision, "and then ask Lestrade to send his men to those in the London area. It will be, I fear, a game of find the lunatic. It seems clear to me how this plague has been contrived, though I confess the why of it is still not entirely apparent." I was still recovering from my swoon and struggled to keep up as Holmes exited the shop via the rear and headed for the nearest post office. I asked him to elaborate. "It seems clear," he said, "that the mysterious chemical with which the book has been impregnated has a delayed effect. Each possessor is disturbed but not deranged at first, feels at an instinctive level there is something wrong with the book and feels a natural desire to rid himself of it. What could be more natural than to unload such a rarity on a fellow bibliophile?" I nodded in agreement, as it made as much sense as any explanation I could think of. but I had to ask about the notes we found in Sproat's office with the reference to the cult of H. And it was only then that I recalled the evil, inhuman voice that had spoken that unfamiliar word. "Hastur!" I exclaimed. Holmes looked down at me in puzzlement. I tried to explain, and he listened carefully as we crossed the road in the fog and then paused outside Seven Dials District Post Office. "You suffered an hallucination, perhaps due to lingering traces of the drug that drove Sproat mad," Holmes said finally. "The glimpse of a cloaked and hooded lady outside the shop, possibly a good customer wondering why Sproat was not open for business, created a bizarre illusion, and while experiencing it, your mind dredged up, from who knows what reserve of random knowledge, the name of a cult you heard at some point, perhaps while serving with our forces in India. Might this Hastur be an obscure Hindu deity?" I conceded that this was a rational explanation, but felt that it somehow fell short of explaining the horror I'd experienced. Holmes, however, was already striding up to the counter where telegrams were compiled. There followed a necessary but tedious interlude in which warnings were sent to all the names on Sproat's list. Then we went to Scotland Yard to alert Lestrade. When we arrived, Lestrade was not there, but we had one of those strokes of luck that, while often spurned by the writer of fiction, occur quite often in real life. It seemed that one of the names on the list, a certain Jacobus Mogg, had been found with the book in his possession, and he was, to quote the sergeant who told us the news, already acting a bit bonkers. Mogg was a wealthy book collector whose dwelling lay in the Knightsbridge area. We arrived at the house by hansom cab and found 2 officers guarding the door. Lestrade, wearing gloves and a surgeon's mask, ushered us inside and offered us similar protection, which we accepted. Mogg was in his library, giggling quietly to himself as he turned the pages of a small, thin book with a worn yellow binding. He was a tall, aristocratic-looking man who might have passed for a clergyman in happier circumstances. At first I wondered if the book contained disturbing pictures of a sort that might send a decent-minded Englishman insane, but then, as we grew closer, I saw that it was in fact set out like a play with the names of characters set down on the left-hand side of the page. "He's not very talkative, Mr. Holmes," Lestrade said. "I've sent for a spring cart to take him to the loony bin, a doctor to certify. It's just a question of getting the magistrate to sign the committal form. No problem there, I think." Holmes nodded tersely, then circled around Mogg's chair to stand directly in front of him. My friend placed a gloved finger on the page and posed a question in an unusually gentle, coaxing voice. "What is it, Mr. Mogg? What is this book that fascinates you?" The collector looked up at Holmes, and I saw the man's face, despite showing obvious good breeding, was becoming that of an imbecile. A thin trickle of drool was running from one corner of the mouth, and the half-moon spectacles were slightly askew. "It is the King in Yellow, good sir," said Mogg in a childlike voice. "It is the most wonderful and terrible book of all." "The King in Yellow? A play, I take it?" Holmes asked, still playing the role of a kindly adult. "And what does the drama concern?" Mogg giggled again and looked down, and then began to read, so far as I can remember, the following verse. "Along the shore the cloud waves break, the twin suns sink behind the lake, the shadows lengthen in Carcosa." "Carcosa?" said Holmes. "Where is Carcosa?" Mogg looked up again, and this time his face bore the hectic, wide-eyed expression of a true maniac. I was already stepping forward when the hapless gentleman sprang to his feet, hands seeking to clutch at Holmes' throat. "We are all in Carcosa," Mogg screamed. "We are all in Carcosa." Holmes did not need my assistance, of course. An accomplished bare-knuckle fighter with lightning reflexes, he easily evaded the attack and grabbed Mogg's arms, pinning him face down into the armchair. I anticipated the struggle, but in the wink of an eye the murderous impulse left the collector, to be replaced by such a weeping and howling that it tore at my heart. I quickly administered a sedative to the poor soul. By the time the asylum van had arrived, Mogg was peaceful again and rambling of Casilda and the King in Yellow. "Who is the King in Yellow?" asked Holmes as the asylum warders fastened Mogg into a straight waistcoat. "Is it Hastur? Is it the person in the hooded cloak?" Mogg looked confused for a moment, then laughed. "You cannot tell the garment from the man," he said, but then frowned in confusion. "Yet he is not a man. No, not a man." He kept mumbling what seemed to be utter gibberish as they bundled him into the van. We watched as they drove the poor soul off to Colney Hatch. He died there a few weeks later, reportedly of a brain aneurysm. "Well, Lestrade," said Holmes, turning over the book in his gloved hands, "we have the mysterious volume. It only remains for me to determine what sort of active agent has been used to render it so hazardous." Lestrade shrugged dismissively. "Rather you than me, Mr. Holmes," he said. "If I was you, I'd chuck it on the fire. But thanks again for all your help." And with that, he left. "Do you think there is a chemical in the pages, Holmes?" I asked. "What else could it be, Watson?" he replied, flicking through the book. "Excess concentration on books might cause mental instability, of course. One sees such things among scholars. But an epidemic of outright insanity? Not a single known case. No, this is a matter of chemistry, not magic." He slipped the volume into a small canvas bag, and we made our way outside. As we waited in the yellow-white roiling fog for a hansom to loom out of the murk, I asked Holmes if he actually intended to read the book. "I may pursue it from idle curiosity, Watson," he said, casually. "Why, do you really think words on a page could tip a mind into lunacy? Or are you afraid that my proneness to melancholy makes me particularly susceptible?" I hesitated, and he laughed, holding up the canvas bag. "Really, Watson, if it makes you feel more comfortable, I promise I will analyze the paper and ignore the words. At first glance, it seems mere trash anyway, some absurd fantasy cast in dramatic form." I grunted non-committally. In another few minutes we had flagged down a cab, and within half an hour we were back at our lodgings. I was so intent on getting indoors that I failed to notice the mark, but Holmes' eye for detail did not fail him. "So, Watson," he said, pausing to examine the daubs of paint by the doorway, "it seems that we, too, have been favoured with the yellow sign." "But who did it, Holmes?" I asked for the umpteenth time. My friend did not pause in his pacing, walking up and down on the Persian rug in front of the fireplace. "Clearly the same person or persons who did it before, Watson, acolytes of some kind of cult. As with the mysterious visiting card, it is the work of someone of intelligence. However, I have high hopes that some allies I set to work yesterday will— speak of the devil, I see we have a new visitor, and a most welcome one." I joined him at the window and glimpsed a small figure disappearing into our lobby. Mrs. Hudson soon showed in a small boy I recognized as one of Holmes' Baker Street irregulars. These street urchins acted as informers and messengers, and were uniformly sharp-eyed, quick-witted, and devoid of personal hygiene. "I take it one of your associates saw the man who daubed the graffito?" Holmes asked without ceremony. The small boy put out a grimy hand, and Holmes chuckled. He respected these ragamuffins more than Scotland Yard. After he'd given the lad a shilling, the boy told his tale. "Yes, young Jimmy was just setting up his shoe-shine stall on the corner when he saw this man what did it." "And did young Jimmy get a good look at the gentleman?" "From what Jimmy says, he wishes he'd never clapped eyes on the bleeder. Bloke was a freak, he said, all twisted round the face, and tall as Goliath, like something from a circus." If I had not seen the irregulars produce reliable information so often in the past, I would have doubted this tale told by one boy to another. Holmes held out another shilling. "Jimmy would not be prone to exaggeration, I trust," he said. The urchin denied this vociferously, and insisted that Jimmy was proper shook up by the encounter. He left with his 2 shillings under strict instructions to give 1 to the shaken shoeshine boy. "Well, Watson, what do you make of that? It shouldn't be too difficult to find a man of enormous stature, hideously deformed. Why, the boy could be right, he might be part of a circus." Holmes was, as so often in the past, ahead of me. He reached for the untidy heap of newspapers and quickly found the page he was looking for. Sure enough, there was a full-page advertisement for Grimaldi's travelling circus. It had pitched its tents on Shoreditch Common a fortnight ago. Tomorrow was its last night. "It seems," said my friend, "that we must pay a visit to what is billed as the greatest spectacle in 2 hemispheres. Do you still have your service revolver?" "Is that necessary?" I asked in surprise. "Surely we're dealing with superstitious cranks and sideshow freaks, not master criminals." Holmes shook his head and raised a finger in rebuke. "No, Watson, not cranks as such. We are, it seems certain, dealing with a cult. A cult as dangerous as any organized crime gang we have crossed swords with in the past. Any religious conviction, remember, can empower an individual to commit extraordinary deeds. The most unremarkable man, when convinced he is acting for a higher purpose, can achieve remarkable things. Sometimes these are the most heinous crimes. From what we have seen so far, it seems this cult of Hastur does not merely excuse atrocities committed by its acolytes, it positively sanctifies them. I spent the next half hour taking apart my old army revolver, examining and oiling its component parts, and reassembling it. I then spent a few minutes checking every one of my cartridges for possible defects and setting aside a couple that looked as if they might misfire. Then we set out for Grimaldi's circus. "It seems incongruous, Holmes," I remarked, as we moved along the rows of booths that surrounded the main marquee. "Why would a cult of any kind have its home in an establishment like this?" "You forget, Watson," my friend replied. "Circuses are traditionally the home of the outcast, the vagrant, the eccentric, those with extraordinary abilities, or even more extraordinary afflictions." He gestured at a sign for the bearded lady, then another that promised sight of a half and half, supposedly an androgynous person. I saw the logic in my friend's argument. The most agile acrobat, the mightiest strong man, or the most cunning conjurer did exist in a twilight world somewhat removed from mundane reality, and superstition is common among show people. Perhaps this Hastur cult flourished in the most fertile of grounds. In the distance I heard the trumpeting of an elephant, the cheers and applause of the crowd. The afternoon performance was under way. "From the description we have, I think we may have found our man," Holmes said. "See the hoarding at the end of the row? Don't look directly, we may be observed." I pretended to contemplate a tent belonging to Madame Zora, who apparently knew the mysteries of the ages. I glanced at the sign in question and saw a grotesque portrayal of a man whose face looked as if it had been melted. Above the crude painting, the phrase "Sargon the Colossus" was picked out in lurid yellow letters. Even in the fog at a distance I recognized the colour of the paint. "Hand on your pistol, Watson," said Holmes. "Let us investigate." The barker in front of the booth was a dwarf, ludicrously attired in military uniform complete with Napoleonic hat. He took our money with effusive thanks and promised thrilling wonders. Then, along with a couple of giggling shop-girls, we were shown into the darkness of the sideshow, where a small crowd was already standing impatiently, jostling and muttering. A small stage was dimly lit by a couple of oil lamps. The London fog had seeped in, combining with onlookers' tobacco smoke to create an unpleasant fug. Then, without any ceremony, the performance, I use the term loosely, began. The being that shambled onto the stage was technically human, and I had seen similar cases of excessive growth in my days as a medical student. But Sargon the Colossus was far bigger than any man I'd seen outside of textbooks. He must have been at least 7 feet tall and immensely powerful in physique. My scientific instincts prompted me to wonder how his ankles and knee joints could support such a vast amount of muscle. His legs, I soon saw, were like great columns ending in feet at least twice the size of a normal man's. But all of that was of secondary significance. It was his face that made the little throng fall back a few paces and prompted several women to cover their eyes. It was one thing to see the distorted flesh in a garish picture, quite another to witness it in real life. If a clumsy child had tried to fashion a man's face from clay, it might have resembled that of the giant now gazing out upon his audience. "Do not be afraid, good people." The voice of the dwarf sounded loud and clear in the murk. The little man leapt up onto the stage, agile as a monkey, and strutted up to the giant. Here I saw the cleverness of a simple contrast. The two might have belonged to different species. Some laughed at the sight, but it was nervous laughter. "I don't like this, Watson," Holmes muttered. I took the hint and clutched my revolver in my overcoat pocket, ready to draw it at a moment's notice. The dwarf strutted back and forth, grimacing and grinning by turns, making ribald remarks at the girls, winking at some of the men, while giving a preposterous account of Sargon's supposed origins. A wild man found scavenging on carrion in the ruins of ancient Babylon, and so forth. All quite preposterous. But there was still something about it that disturbed me. And then the dwarf made a great fuss about introducing the beauty who tamed the beast. Someone backstage struck a gong. Then there was the sound of exotic music played on some kind of flute. A woman walked gracefully onto the stage, and even in the poor light I could see that she was indeed remarkably beautiful. Her voluptuous form was dressed in something like Arabic attire, complete with a jewelled veil, and revealing rather more flesh than a decent Englishwoman would. Such was her loveliness that it was only when she began to dance sinuously around the giant that I realized she had no arms. It was a bizarre, sensuous spectacle, and I felt vaguely sullied simply by witnessing it, and yet I could not look away. "Shame!" shouted someone. "Not right!" "Indecent!" bellowed a cultivated voice. "Christian country, by Jove!" There were also a few cat-calls and jeers, and some people began to shoulder their way back towards the entrance. I wondered if the dwarf had misjudged his audience, but far from being disconcerted, the tiny barker seemed pleased by the reaction. "Zuleika the seductress weaves her feminine wiles upon the hapless giant." It was hardly necessary to announce the fact. The dusky dancer swayed and wriggled her way around Sargon, and his enormous hideous features contorted in what might have been a smile. More people left, and there were demands for refunds. The dwarf casually hurled a few coins after the departing Londoners, and suddenly I realized that Holmes and I were now quite conspicuous. So few people were left in the tent. "I think we ought to leave," I hissed urgently. "No, Dr. Watson, the show is only just beginning." I gawped up at the dwarf, and saw that the giant and the armless woman were now gazing down at us, as if we were the freaks on show. Then the handful of people remaining before the stage turned to look at us, and I saw that that was, indeed, the case. A bearded woman lifted her veil. What I'd taken to be a young man took off a broad-brimmed hat to reveal startlingly feminine features. A huge woman smirked as she strode towards us, the earth actually shaking as she walked. Another woman threw off a cloak to reveal a near-naked body covered in tattoos. Two girls of Asian appearance revealed themselves to be joined at the hip. We were surrounded by the denizens of the sideshows. "If you know my friend Watson, you know me," said Holmes, with all his customary self-assurance, "and you would be foolish to tangle with us." I produced my revolver and cocked the hammer, but I did not presume to fire. None of the Hastur cultists, who else could they be, had come within reach of us. They merely formed a semicircle between us and the closed tent flap. Yet it had already occurred to me that, with my pocket-knife, I might simply slash through the canvas of the tent. "Your gun is no use to you, Doctor," said the dwarf, leaping gracefully down from the stage. The giant lowered the dancing girl and then stepped down from the low dais himself, much as a normal man might negotiate a slightly high step. "We are not your enemies," said Zuleika in a sweet, gentle voice. "We mean you no harm, believe me. We merely seek to convert you to the one true faith." Holmes gave his familiar, humourless laugh and surprised me by producing the book, its covers bound shut by a rubber band. "This is your gospel?" he asked. "So precious that you impregnate its pages with poison? Hardly the work of God-fearing folk." The androgynous youth took a step closer, eyes fixed hungrily on the king in yellow. I covered him with my pistol, and he froze, a delicate tongue running across his red lips. "We need not fear our God," said Zuleika, "for he brings us only truth, yet it sends the mundane ones insane. You, who have spent so much time in the shadows, seen so much that is vile, might be able to bear the truth." There was a ripple of assent among the watchers. "You have not yet read the book, Mr. Holmes," said the dwarf. "If you had, we should know. You would either be one of us or among the lost." "Then there is no subtle poison?" Holmes demanded. Laughter, surprisingly good-humoured, greeted that question. "The first of those worldly men stole a rare book, read it, and paid the price," said Zuleika. "Many centuries ago a wise man hid the words of our faith in the form of fiction, so anyone searching for a holy text would not find it. But the king in yellow remains true, and those who are too closely bound to this foul world, this so-called civilization, cannot bear to encounter its truth." "Nonsense," I exclaimed. Switching the gun to my left hand, I took out my knife and slashed at the tent. Calling to Holmes to follow me, I scrambled through the hole, falling to my knees in my haste. I stood up and was about to run for it when a familiar shape loomed out of the fog. It swept towards me, gliding like a ship on calm water, its yellow robe rippling as it passed over the grass. I fired straight into where the chest of the robed figure must be. I fired again, left-handed, into the darkness within the hood. I might as well have been shooting blanks. The fabric writhed and flowed, then reached out tentacles along the ground that wrapped around my ankles. I felt a moist coldness as the questing members gripped my flesh through fabric. I lashed out at the hood, which flopped backwards and revealed nothing, an absence more horrifying than the most monstrous visage. And it was then that I realized the horrific truth about Hastur, the king in yellow. The robe was the creature itself, an almost formless mass of some unimaginable protoplasmic matter formed into the semblance of a garment. The god was utterly inhuman, but mocked our human preconceptions by mimicking our form so cleverly that it might pass for one of us, in a London particular. I thought of the demented gibbering of poor Jacobus Mogg. He clearly divined this truth through his reading of the play, but had not succeeded in warning us. "In the name of God, get away from me!" I yelled, slashing with my knife. I might as well have been trying to stop a mudslide. It oozed up my body, enclosed me with its foul self. And then I was at one with Hastur, and I saw the truth that the carnival freaks had spoken of. In a timeless moment, I saw it all. I saw the future of our world, the terrible ordeals that our species would inflict upon itself in centuries to come. Worse still, I saw a tiny world against its cosmic background, saw how small we are, how ephemeral, and how absurd all our pretensions to glory and wisdom are. That would have been bad enough, but it was not merely a vision that possessed me there, among those shabby sideshows. No, I felt it all. I felt throughout my being the suffering that had been and was to be, until the human race is finally extinguished. I became every soldier who spilled his blood in battle, every woman who perished in childbirth, every child who starved to death. I had seen death on the battlefield and in the operating theatre, but this was far beyond mere human experience, and there was more and worse. Wars unimaginable, each one a monstrous process of mechanized slaughter that consumed millions of lives. And then came the killing of the defenseless, the innocent. Always the children. So many faces, so many eyes looking into mine, so many unmarked faces, confused and afraid and soon to be lifeless. It was a god's perspective, the truth of Hastur, absolute and inarguable, and I could not bear it. I was an inhabitant of Carcosa, the city of eternal nightmares. I heard a maniacal howl and recognized my own voice. And then the pain was gone, the vision faded, and I was aware of my friend leaning over me, his normally stern features showing genuine concern. And I felt something else, an unpleasant dampness seeping into my garments as I was laying on my back next to the ripped sideshow tent. "Are you injured, Watson?" What could I say? "No, I am physically unharmed." Holmes helped me back on my feet. Only then did I think to ask what had happened to the cult members. The explanation was surprising. "I gave them back their book, Watson. I know it is odd that I should simply acquiesce to their demands, but my failure to find any evidence of poison on the paper, plus their total lack of motive to attack a series of bibliophiles, gave me little choice. No crime was committed, unless you count their relieving us of 6pence each, and even then, I think we got our money's worth, eh?" I couldn't reply. I stared open-mouthed at the grotesque figures disappearing into the fog as the cultists withdrew peacefully. Now I knew that I had come close to grasping a reality that had sent so-called normal men insane, while bonding outcasts into a faith of sorts. "Watson, what happened?" I looked into the keen eyes of my brilliant friend and tried to find the right words. Then I stumbled into a feeble account of tripping over a guy rope and hitting my head. Some truths cannot be told. "Very well," said Holmes, "let us return to our lodgings," calling at the telegraph office along the way. "We must inform Lestrade that the epidemic of madness is at an end." I did not have the heart to tell him how wrong he was. And that, gentle reader, is my tale. It is an ill-proportioned thing, I admit, something of a sideshow prodigy, one might say. But like those hapless creatures who stood before us in that shabby tent, it is very real. I have set down my account before the details fade and I become more susceptible to a rational explanation. Choose to disbelieve it if you will, but if you take one thing from this narrative, let it be this. Beware the king in yellow. Avoid the yellow sign. If you overhear someone speak knowingly of the alluring Casilda or the realm of Carcosa, do not listen, but seek out the clangour of the everyday world.